now?
That's a great question. Actually, it started for me around 1994, and it started with tequila, actually. And what happened was I had a best friend that would go down to visit family in Mexico once, 2, 3 times a year, probably. And then he would always bring me back a couple bottles, and we would crack them together. And then we would just have like one little pour each, and then I'd put the cap on and put it in the bar, and it started growing. And within a year, I would say, between me collecting and him bringing me bottles, I started getting up to about 60. And so then I decided, you know what, I need to branch out, because if I have people coming over and they don't drink tequila, I'm kind of, lost. So that's when I started branching out into rums, into bourbons, whiskeys, single malts, and all that. And then, for my education wise, because back in 1994, we're at the beginning of the internet. So there really wasn't a lot of information for, is this a good purchase? Now we can just jump on our phones, but back then it was like, you just got to kind of have to buy it. And so I made a lot of bad purchases, I would say, in the very beginning, just because I didn't know. And so that's kind of what led up to my YouTube channel, was because I decided I wanted to help others with their selections and that type of thing.
And what were you doing before, getting into whiskey? What was your career beforehand? Was it at all related to spirits?
No, I was just a government employee. It was all I was doing for 25 years. And then I guess 5 years ago now is when I actually retired from that position and focused entirely on spirits.
So from tequila through to, obviously we're a whiskey group, so we're going to mostly talk about whiskey.
Yes.
But what was your sort of first whiskey that you fell in love with? What region was it from? Was it America? Was it Scotch? Was it Irish? What was your kind of?
To be honest, it actually probably was bourbon, and it probably was the Squatty Van Winkle 10s. Remember, they used to do the 90 proof and the 107 gold and red necks. And those were the ones that I fell in love with. And then I started, back then I could kind of go around and just pick up a few. It was just, you had to search a little bit. They weren't everywhere. But that was probably my very first love in the bourbon world.
And have you still got one of those bottles now, or?
Yes, yeah, I've got them.
Because I was thinking you must have quite a few bottles that because I can see your collection's obviously amazing, that you've kept and are probably now worth so much and are so hard to get hold of. I know you probably don't like that question, but you don't even want to drink them now, because you're not going to be able to get hold of them.
That's the sad thing, is that I bought a lot of stuff to drink because I enjoyed them. And so, I would put them in my little back stock and then, drink through 1, 2, and then now I'm getting ready to grab another, and it's like, oh no, the price is way exceeded the quality now. And it's like, oh, well, let's just go ahead and crack it anyway. It'll be all right.
And what's your go-to bourbon that you would sort of always gravitate towards?
So for right now, for the money, something that's pretty much readily available, it's not too expensive. There's two that jump to mind. One is the Early Times Bottled in Bond. I really enjoy that one. For a long time, it was Kentucky only. And when they were Kentucky only, I found the quality to be, I guess they were just a little better quality than they are when they went nationwide for us. But I really like that one. And then the Woodford Double Oak has always been just a nice little good round bourbon for me.
Nice. We actually we did a barrel pick of that. So Ed, you were out there, weren't you, for that one?
I didn't go out for the Woodford one.
Was that Chris? It was Chris, wasn't it?
Chris and it was Chris and Andrew. But I think that was the last. Was that the last barrel pick they did? Now they do. They do it in a different way now. I know that.
Yeah, I think I can't remember what it was. There was Andrew Watson will be able to tell us. It was something about maybe double oaks. Maybe they don't do double oak store picks anymore, or barrel picks. But it was a really, really, really good pick.
Oh, yeah.
And just a couple more questions from me, and then we'll start taking. I know Ed's got a couple. Then we'll start going to the group and seeing what they're saying. But any particular style of whiskey that you don't like?
Or spirit. I mean,
you
seem to have everything covered, but is there anything you're not into?
Yeah.
Not really. I kind of enjoy everything for different reasons, even if they're really unique and odd. There was a Chinese herbal liqueur that I tasted recently called supposedly used to be made with tiger bone, but now they just do a bunch of herbs. And it is crazy. It's like drinking liquid incense and curry. And it's crazy, but I actually kind of enjoy it. Yeah. But other than that, no, I kind of enjoy everything. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask a couple of questions about your collection, because obviously when we see you on YouTube and you've got that amazing collection behind you, I know you've done a few years back, you did your all-time best bourbons, I think, which you had some crazy rare stuff going on in there. How far back does your collection go? Does it go back to 94? And
yes. Yeah.
and
Oh,
most of your bottles are open in the shelves behind. Do you have another area which has got your backup bottles? I mean, where do you keep those? Do you have like a storage unit?
I do. I have actually. So let's see. With first gassing and stuff, I do use argon on all my open bottles. The only exception is when I crack a bottle, let's say like a cast strength, like a Stag Junior or something, and I feel like it's a little too hot, then I won't gas it right away. I'll usually let that sit out for about a month and then revisit it and see how it's doing, whether it's spice is starting to calm down. And then once it hits that really nice mark, then I'll go ahead and start gassing it. But as far as the other bottles, my backstock, I actually have 2 closets that are pretty full. And unfortunately, it doesn't make my wife so happy sometimes, but got to store it somewhere, right?
Yeah, and where is the room you're in at the moment? Is this a special dedicated room you've got?
No, it's like a family den room area. Yeah.
And your wife is cool with that?
Yeah, she fell in love with bourbon as well, thankfully.
Okay.
So we took a trip, I think around 2013 to Kentucky, and she really grew to love it. So especially Four Roses, she's a Four Roses girl. And after that, she was totally fine with it. So
fantastic.
It's quite funny. Someone in the group just said, "Wow, that's not a Zoom backdrop." I think they thought you dropped down there. In fact, if you can send me a photo of that, I might start using it as my backdrop.
That's good. Let's see. What was the other part of that question?
Go on. Yeah, sorry. Carry on.
I know what it was. It was asking whether the collection went back to 94 as far as bourbons and whiskeys. I would say 94. I started collecting on the whiskey side of things in 95, heading into 96. It was the back end of 95 because the first year and a half I spent collecting and learning, studying tequila. But then in 95, when I started going out and actually starting to buy a lot of whiskeys, I could still find a lot of, what we consider now really dusty bottles, the old granddad 114s and the squatty bottles, National Distillers stuff, all that stuff was still out there. So even though I started collecting around 95, 96, I was collecting some from the late 80s, probably in the 70s.
Wow. Got some great stuff. So, and before it all peaked, really, before the big rush on brown spirits and stuff happened. So yeah, you've seen that whole kind of curve happen, really. You've lived through it.
When people ask me when that occurred, in my mind, I always feel it occurred between 2009 and 2011. It was right in there where we started seeing this really big uptick and people getting into it, which is great. And now, I mean, it's ridiculous the amount of groups that are out there, and everyone's doing really, good picks, and it's a lot more of a good community, I would say. People are learning from each other now a lot more than in the past.
I know you're a little bit reticent to get involved with talking about allocated bottles on your channel. I think because you probably feel like they already have enough exposure, and you're not really adding anything new to is my guess. But what about every now and then you must try one of those bottles with friends or just yourself and go, actually, I would like to talk about this. What stops you from doing that? Is it just simply because people won't be able to get hold of it, or is it just not excite you?
Yeah, usually like in my year-end, best of spirits review videos, I don't include the allocated bottles only because I know they are very hard for, like you said, others to get, and I don't, I don't want people to overpay for things. That's another thing that I kind of try to avoid. And so I don't want to go recommending, this George T. Stagg is great every year, which for a long time it really was. And then, people really pressing the budgets to go out there and overspend, in my opinion, for some of those bottles. Yeah. So that's really the only reason.
Yeah. And what about when it comes to craft distilleries, ones that have emerged in the sort of last decade since 2009, 10, 11? Which of those do you really think are doing a great job?
Let's see, there are a few. Mostly I find that it seems like, everyone does something really well. And so it may not be the entire line, but for me personally, since I'm kind of local to them and I work with them, Iron Root seems to be doing a lot of really good things with the Texas grains. The thing that I fell in love with them about was the fact that they are really truly grain to glass and they watch every step of the way. And so, I've been to several craft distilleries where they don't really know what's going on with their barrels. They just know these are from last year, these are from the year before. And I'm like, okay, well, what about this barrel? What's this barrel doing? And they don't know until they're opening them. And whereas Iron Root, they're constantly keeping notes on every barrel. So guys like that, I really enjoy. I think they're doing a good job. Corsair, I always liked Corsair. A lot of their single barrels can be really good. Of course, they do a lot of experimentation with multiple grains, and it gets a little kind of muddy in there with that. But who else has been doing really good lately?
What about like Wilderness Trail and Peerless?
Yeah, I mean, they're doing great. Another one local, kind of again local to me, is Lone Elm, that's starting to show up on people's radars. The wheat whiskey, but it's got tons of tobacco and clove and leather. I mean, it is a deep, deep whiskey that people are starting to take notice on. So yeah, Andalusian, that's another one. So, but
I've got
mostly Texas.
I've got a couple of questions actually. Just leading off from kind of what Ed was saying about allocated stuff, because I saw your Weller comparison video on Patreon. And obviously you had the new Buffalo Trace Wellers, and then you had some of the old Stitzel Weller. And it was clearly from when you were testing them, because you were laughing when you were like doing it. Some of the Stitzel Weller ones were amazing, and I think it won. I can't remember which one it was. The old 10-year-old
Centennial 10.
Yes. Yeah. And I know you use, it's a sort of related question. I know you use argon in your bottles, because there's a lot of debate about what happens to whiskey in the bottle and what happens as it ages and whether it oxidizes. Do you have any opinion on what you think it is that is, or you clearly think it does change in the bottle, which is why you use the argon. Yes. What is it that you think is changing? And what do you think it is about those older kind of Stitzel Weller bottles or National Distillers, stuff like that, that has that very distinctive kind of butterscotchy age taste? Where do you think that comes from? Do you think that comes from aging in the bottle, or was it tasting like that at the time? From your memory and your experience, what do you think's going on there?
Okay, so as far as oxidation and the argon gas, for me, I've had enough experience with multiple bottles to have seen it firsthand, where there's some bottles that I know they do change, and some people will call it, they degrade, well, they're degrading in the presence of oxygen. So it is an oxygen effect. But when they start to degrade, some of them, it'll help them. Like I said, when they're really big, spicy, hot, whether it's a single malt or a bourbon, and you give them time, that spice tends to knock off a little bit. And as far as, like, I've had bottles of the Octomore 6.3, for example. That's one bottle that when you first crack it, and if we want to go on the bourbon side of things, another one would be, a lot of the Elijah Craig barrel proofs or the Stag Juniors. When you first crack them, they're really big and hot, and sometimes they're just a little too much for people. But if you just get them below the neck and let them rest for usually a month to 2 months is where I find they start to calm down. You'll really notice a big effect, a big change there. Stag Junior Batch 1, if anybody remembers that one, that was a beast when you cracked it. Super hot. But then if you gave it, that one needed like 4 or 5 months. It took a long time for that. But once it got there, really calmed down. It drank really well. But as far as, let's see, the second part of that was,
the older stuff, the
older stuff.
the older bourbons?
So the older bourbons, to me, I think it's a combination of factors. First, I think it was a big part was that they had a surplus. So I think in their blends, even though it was Centennial 10, there may have been 10 upwards of 15-year-old bourbon barrels being dumped into that blend, especially back then when they were trying to compete with single malts who were, or blends for that matter, were outselling everyone from the Scottish side of things. So they're really trying to make a really high quality product back then. So I think they were blending in older stock. Another big difference, I think, are the oak barrels that they were in. Slow growth oak back in the day, being seasoned outdoors for a year at least, that was a big part of it. To whereas now we're kind of like fast tracking that part of, and I think that is having a, for me, a kind of a negative effect on our whiskeys today. Those are the biggest things. And then I've spoken with several big distillers and I've asked them, why is it that some of the old whiskeys have this really kind of what I like to refer to as a garage funk or a machine oil characteristic to them? What is it that, you know, gave it that? And they'll tell you, well, most of the time it was just that we weren't so automated. So there was a lot of human, we'll call it human error. Maybe things weren't as clean as they are now. And we weren't as careful with the distillations as we are now. So maybe it's a multiple combination of factors there.
Yeah, because people often say it's about the water, don't they? They talk about the water, or sometimes how the bottles were older than they were labeled up to be, so they just behave differently. But we'll never really know, will we? It's one of those things. It's just lost to history.
Yep.
So a couple of questions that have come from different people. So Andy's asked, Liquorhound, understand the liquor, but why the hound?
Oh, good. Another good question. So my wife, when I used to go out and be collecting a lot, this is, again, late 90s. When I do my government job, I would get off work around 2:30, 1:30, somewhere in the afternoon. And so as soon as I got off work, I would go out and hunt bottles. And I would go all over my North Texas area. And I would be gone from 2:30. I'd probably get home around 6:30-ish, maybe as late as 8:30 if it was a really good day or something. And then she would always say, you know, where were you out antiquing? You know, are you out there looking for those dusty bottles? And I'm like, yeah. She goes, you're like a little hound dog. You're always out there all over the place, just chasing these bottles everywhere. You're kind of like a liquor hound. And I was like, wow, I kind of like that. I said, I guess that's what I am, liquor hound.
Amazing. And do you still do that now? Do you still find yourself like jumping in the car and driving around trying to get, I mean, or are your connections, I imagine they run pretty deep now?
Well, I do have connections, but to be honest, I don't take them up on a lot of bottles that I get offered. It's only because, like for me, to be not sounding weird or anything, but I've had, you know, all the Van Winkles and stuff like that, and Michter's 20 and all that. So I mean, for me to take that away from somebody else that's never experienced it or something like that, I just usually just let them pass on them and let the store give them out to some of their other really good customers that are maybe just now getting into it. Yeah, stuff like that.
Andy also was saying, second question is, do you enjoy the older dated pours or the newer ones?
I'm sorry, repeat that one.
He said, do you enjoy the older dated pours or the newer ones? I guess what he's saying is like the older bottles over the newer ones. I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. Personally, I prefer older whiskeys to the modern styles. To me nowadays, like recently, here's a great example. I had an Elijah Craig 18 single barrel, I guess right before all this kind of went south. But I got to taste that and I was surprised at how vibrant and fruity it was. And it lacked a lot of the oak and richness that I remembered it having. Of course, we're talking pre-Fire Heaven Hill, pre-96. Those were really oaky, dense, and they didn't have as much bright fruit. And it seems like nowadays we're seeing a lot of bright fruit characteristics coming out on our bourbons, for example. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, what do you prefer? And for me, I like very mature, rich, dense, heavy bourbons. So I tend to lean backwards there.
So we had another question, which was, what's your take on the 1792 Foolproof, and would you agree it's the best whiskey in 2020?
Ooh, so I really like them. I think they are, fortunately, they're one of those that haven't become, crazily allocated or sought after. And I think they do a really good bourbon for the money right now. It's one of the best buys out there. I would agree with that. As far as the best of 2020,
we're not even halfway through yet.
Yeah, it's always a solid pick. I'll say that about them. It's always you can feel pretty confident with buying the full proof 1792.
Another question is, what is your unicorn?
Oh,
there must be something that you haven't had or you haven't been able to buy. Red Hook Rye.
I've tasted it. I've been very fortunate to have good friends that have nice little connections to other real rare things like that. So I've tasted them. What was that other one? There was not the Martin Mills, the Bourbon Valley.
Oh yeah, Bourbon Valley. Yeah.
Ooh, yeah, really enjoyed that one. Wish I could get that one, but that's maybe.
The thing is, a lot of those bottles ended up in Japan, didn't they? A lot of those, the Martin Mills 24, Bourbon Valley, actually a lot of the old Willets, the Sea Barrels, a lot of them were store picks for Japanese bars as well, weren't they? So they had a huge treasure trove, even up until 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah.
When this group started, we found we got a tip off. It was when the group started, and it was Ed, myself, Andrew, all of us. We were in. We got a tip off that there was a bar in London that had a bottle of the Bitter Truth, and we went there and we got a double for 35 quid, about $40 each, and it was so amazing. It's probably one of the most amazing ryes I've ever had. By the time we went back to the bar to get another one, or we were talking about trying to buy the rest of the bottle, the bar manager had been upstairs and made a phone call, and then it was withdrawn for sale because they realized how much it was worth. I think it was about 9,000 a bottle by that time.
I will never forget that story, because I think even then I was thinking to myself, I'm not spending that much money on that much whiskey. I was like, that's ridiculous. And then we did, and then it was like,
it was sublime.
I don't know. It was almost like, it was like oil, wasn't it? It was like thick oil. And like Ed said, we tried, I think we were so excitable that when we went back to try and get some more, they were like, okay, something's going on here. We should. So it was. I have a similar
little kind of story like that. And that was, Booker's bourbon, the old 1979 brown wax, right? It was the original Friends and Family Booker's. I had a chance, I was on auction and I was going to buy one because I had a brown wax 81, but I wanted another one. And so I looked on auction and they had another brown wax Booker's. Did not show a close enough picture to give me the year or anything, but I figured I'd go ahead and bid on it. So I ended up buying it for roughly around $400, which to me back then was pushing it, but went ahead and did it. And then when it came in, and I looked at the bottle, I realized it was the Friends and Families Booker's. And so that's how I actually got my bottle of that. Sheer luck. Thankfully, they didn't put it in the description because I would have never been able to afford that bottle.
It's funny. I think I can't remember who it was, Ed, but maybe we shouldn't say actually, but I know someone managed to get I think it was an A bottle of the Van Winkle rye. It may have even been the series that preceded that, which was like the very first run of Van Winkles, and I think they paid like, I don't know, like 100 quid for it or something,
on
like
a Japanese auction.
Yeah, it was crazy.
It was Watson, wasn't it, and Chris?
Oh well, I mean, that's just mental, isn't it?
I think it was mislabeled on an auction or something like that.
Those days are long gone. Those are long gone. I mean, even that was about 4 years ago, and that was just at the time was like, what on earth's happened there? But so it's funny because sometimes these things go up for auction, and sometimes they're put up by people who maybe just don't know the true value. So, or they're not labeled properly. I've actually emailed auctions before in the past and said, not to sound like that guy, but you've labeled that bottle wrong. That's actually not the right bottle, and they'll come back because they're processing so many, aren't they?
Yeah.
Okay, so a couple more questions. So can you tell us anything about any reviews that you've got planned for the future? Any sort of reviews you've got coming up?
So on my Patreon channel, I'm doing a review a week over there. So I'm constantly, recording videos for there. On YouTube, I'm trying to do at least still one a month, like I've always done. One that I have coming up that I need to do is another, and this isn't going to drill the bourbon crowd, but I need to get more Mezcal's reviews in on YouTube, maybe just do a lineup. That's coming up. As far as bourbons on YouTube, the one that I wanted to do was comparing, I kind of like the way I did that Weller comparison of the old versus new. So I'm kind of thinking I want to do some of that maybe with other Heaven Hill products, or maybe even some older Buffalo Trace, compared to some newer stuff. So maybe that's going to be coming up pretty soon.
Nice. Another question. This is a good one. So Mark's asked, do you think that the best distillate means bottled whiskey will have a better chance of being great, or is it too hard to predict given all the variables of aging?
One more time.
So do you think that the best distillate means the bottled whiskey will have a better chance of being great, or is it too hard to predict given all the variables of aging? So just distillate in general, do you think a better distillate fares better, makes for a better whiskey?
Yeah, to me, it's the barrel makes so much change, so much difference. You can do, a really solid distillation, and if you matured in the wrong location, or you're not careful with the type of oak you selected or the way it was seasoned, I think you can actually damage your distillate. I don't know if that answered it.
Yeah, no. I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because sometimes people or distilleries talk so fondly about how good even just the white dog is, but it's kind of a bit of an irrelevant conversation for me anyway, because it's like, well, that's not what I'm going to be buying when I want to drink it. So let's talk in 2 or 3 years time. But I'm particularly, I like we did a barrel pick with New Riff, and it's only 4 years old, but man, it tastes a lot older than that. It's a much more complex whiskey than other younger or similarly aged craft distilled whiskey. So yeah, I'm always sort of interested to try new sort of brands that are sort of getting good reviews for their young whiskies, because it tells you a lot about where they're going, doesn't it?
Definitely. That was it. New Riff comes to mind. That's one of those. It's still pretty young, but they're starting to produce very solid single barrels out there. So looking forward to what they're going to be doing.
This is another question. I'm actually keen to hear the answer to this as well. And it says Lucas has said, I beg for forgiveness from BBS, but what's your favorite Scotch at the moment? And is Scotch for USA like bourbon for us? Tricky to get and stupidly overpriced.
Yes, I would say that. It is harder to get. The prices are going through the roof, but I think that's more of the distilleries taking advantage of the market, let's say. But my favorite single malt right now, for a daily pour, one that I kind of got recently was the strangely a Costco brand, the Kirkland brand. The Speyside 22 year. Pretty impressed with that one for $80. I think that was a really good buy. But as far as other single malts that I really enjoyed, a lot of them are single barrels. A lot of single barrels from different, Deanston did a fantastic sherry one a couple years ago under the Signatory Unchill Filtered Collection. That was a first fill sherry, but that was just crazy for only I think it was $70. So sometimes you can run into a lot of really good single barrels. And I think the independent bottler is where I'm finding the value in scotches over here, at least for us.
Can I just jump in with a related question on bourbon?
Sure.
So last year, your 2019 picks were, it was Stag Junior Batch 12, Best Bourbon, followed by E.H. Taylor Single Barrel 2019. And then it was the very old St. Nick 12-year-old as a sort of standby for if you got a bit more money. Then for the rye, it was the Pikesville that won. Then it was second place, Old Forester Rye. And then you had the Knob Creek Cask Strength Rye as a, if you got a bit more money to spend. And then the Canadian, it was Rare Perfection 14. And then you also did a bourbons under $30. So you had Larceny 1792 small batch, Knob Creek small batch, Wild Turkey 101, and Old Grandad 114. Is there a bourbon you would, if you were introducing somebody to bourbon, what would be your pick as an introductory way for them into it?
Okay, so, wow, that's kind of a unique question. I like that because typically people, the question I get a lot is coming from the bourbon world, going into the Scotch world, you know, what do you recommend? Now, when I do that, there's always a bridge to me, are the older single grain Scotch whiskeys. Those to me have those sweeter coconut profile that we tend to find in some really good bourbons. So I usually use that as the bridge. But if you're just now coming into bourbon, let's say from ground zero, I might start them out on that Woodford Double O, to be honest. I think that's a really nice, Woodford always aims to be very balanced. They're not crazy in any one direction. So I tend to find Chris Morris's stuff usually good for, you know, those early palates. Yeah.
Cool.
I think it's a gateway for a lot of people, isn't it? I know Andrew, Watson, myself, and quite a few others. I think Woodford Reserve's one of the first, if not the first bourbon they end up trying.
Yeah. I mean, you can always go, you know, the regular Buffalo Trace is not bad. A good way to start. Yeah, I mean, there's multiple little entry points, I guess. Let's see. It's another good one. Yeah,
so here's Andy's asking, roughly how many bottles do you have in your collection?
So I'm just over, in total, 2,500 bottles. I think I'm like at 25, somewhere in there. On the bar, on the shelf, I have about 1,475 as a total that are open on the bar.
Do you keep an inventory of everything then?
Yes. Yeah, I have a spreadsheet that I keep track of how many I have in bag stock and stuff like that.
Wow, that's mad. So another question I had actually was, talk us a little bit, I'm going to regret doing this, tell us a little bit about the bottle you were drinking at the very beginning when we were just having a quick chat before we went live.
Oh, well, I got two here, but started with the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. This happens to be C919. Really enjoyed that one last year. Was it 136.8 proof? I mean, it's huge, but to me, you know, if you can't, well, I mean, this past George T. Stagg was watered down compared to that, and it's a big bourbon.
Because the Elijah Craig bottles were quite obtainable here for a long time, same as the Blantons straight from the barrel. For about, it must have been, Ed, would you say about a year ago it all changed?
Pretty much, yeah.
For a long time they were readily available. You could go and get them from Master of Malt, various other places, and you could pay not too much for them, and they would be, you know, very good whiskies. I remember the Hazmat Elijah Craig, the 70.2% or the 140 proof was just dormant. No one knew about it for a long time, and then it started to get talked about in the group, and then they just, within a week or two, we talk about this thing often, which is like the BBS effect, and that, you know, bottles get mentioned in the group and it's like wildfire. They just disappear online. You can't find them anywhere, and that was one of those bottles. I didn't even get one, but they seem to create some, I mean, people talk about those whiskies as if they're sort of worthy of being in the BTAC line, but at affordable prices. It seems like those days are starting to end as well.
Yeah, I mean, when the Elijah Craig started winning the awards, I think there was at E517, the one that won the award. You know, when those started hitting, I think that's when we started noticing the demand starting to really peak up for them, especially the old squatty ones. Around here, those have been gone for a long time. Hazmat, beautiful bourbon. The best one under that line, in my opinion, that they've ever done easily is that one. But
Really?
yeah.
The C919.
Yes, you know, I enjoy it. Yeah, if you can get it, I'd pick one up.
So any bottle that you'd like to grab from the shelf that you would sort of, that you think we might be interested in, something that either is new or just like an older bottle, something that maybe would just be worth having a chat about? There's so much there.
Let me look.
Because I've watched that review of your older bottles before, and am I right in thinking this is going to sound creepy, but it's the top middle shelf?
Yeah. You know what? To be honest, one that I did recently and I helped with the makers, the private select that they do with the different staves. One that I did recently, I guess it wasn't actually recently, it was a year ago, with the Houston Bourbon Society. Was it with them? I did one with them, and I did one with Angel's Liquor here in North Texas. I think it was the Angel's Liquor pick. To me, I've tasted multiples of those, and when anytime they start mixing up a bunch of the different staves together, to me it tends to get almost too muddy, and it just starts tasting like regular makers. And the one that I did for Angels was a combination of the Mocha stave and the Maker's 46 staves, and that was it. Two staves. It was very dense. Again, that deep cocoa note that I really like, old leather, those were in there. And a lot of people that had that one tended to really enjoy that profile because it was different. It was unique than typical makers. So, of course, Bill Jr.'s pick is always 1046, Maker's 46 staves. And mine was pretty much almost a 50-50 split of those two. And it was really, really solid.
I think Ed and Andrew went to Makers. Was it the end of last year? Ed?
Yeah, we did it. We did one of the private selects. So
yeah, Chris was just talking about that actually. What was the combination that you did? I can't remember the combination.
So we went half and half with the Cuvée. We went big and bold. So it's half of the Cuvée stakes and half of the Makers 46 staves.
That's good. That's smart. See, that's what I'm talking about. Don't get too creative when there. It always gets too muddy. But yeah,
that's what we kind of felt when we went over there, because we've had a few different picks that we've tried over in the UK. Mm-hmm. So we just wanted to go for they're the kind of two alpha staves that they have. But yeah, and I know Bill Samuels Jr. just went for I think you mentioned this on one of your things, but he just went Makers 46 all the way. Yeah. Which is the one you can get in the gift shop there, which is that is another really good one.
Yep, exactly. Another going back to the 1792s, a lot of the bottle and bonds that they're starting to release are store picks, and they're doing some really good stuff. To me, the value might be in that line right now.
Yeah,
I think we'll have to get you one of our picks over soon. Maybe we can make it into a video.
Oh yeah, I'd love to do that.
We've had quite a few American members in the group for a long time, and people that we know live over there, so I'm sure we can sort it out somehow.
Awesome. I'd be happy to.
I've just got another question actually. Kind of going forward, what kind of trends do you see? Where do you think we are in terms of, this gets asked a lot, in terms of the peak bourbon, peak Scotch, and then maybe what's going on at the moment with the coronavirus may affect things a little bit, but where do you think we are in terms of like brown spirits and other categories? Are there other things that you think are going to come to the fore, like tequila more? I mean, it's already tequila and mezcal. What kind of trends do you think we're going to see in the next couple of years?
Well, on the bourbon side of things, whiskey in general, right before this whole COVID situation, I felt like we were starting to hit the tipping point to where the quality was decreasing and the price was increasing far enough that I started to feel like the people like us that were knowledgeable about it are kind of like, you know what, they're just starting to like price gouges now. It's getting a little out of hand. And so some things were getting way too pricey. So I started thinking they were hitting that tipping point where they were going to start seeing it sit on shelves. And so they were going to have to realize that we were either going to have to raise the quality or lower the price. And I started feeling like we were there. And then COVID hit, and now there's some report that just came out that the United States is consumption and buying of alcohol is up 50%. So it's like it had the opposite effect when everybody had to stay home. So now I don't know what's going to happen. But as far as what I think is going to happen, I still think we're going to hit that trend where people are becoming knowledgeable enough to know that they're not getting their money's worth sometimes. And so we'll start seeing some brands, some bottling sit on shelves, like especially the higher end type stuff, sit on shelves a lot longer and kind of cause them to reconsider what their releases should be. Other spirits, I think rum's going to come around, hopefully. So there's a real big push, especially from the bourbon world into the rum world, about Barbados rums being pure rums, no sugar additives, stuff like that. And I think it would be beneficial for them, especially Barbados in particular, to kind of like play on that and start doing a lot of single cask releases, which they're starting to do. And I think we'll start seeing that pick up more, and we'll start seeing rums start to focus on less sugar, more transparency about what's going on in the bottlings. And so I could potentially see rum starting to take off. Mezcal, again, they've been doing really well. Tequila's been stagnating for a while now. It's almost like they were sitting on their laurels for a long time, and Mezcal just started, hey, we're going to put everything, all the details on the bottle. We're going to tell you exactly what village it's from, what type of, was it a clay pot distillation, or as copper pot? It doesn't, they do different things over there. But they started pulling all that information, and people really kind of enjoy that. So I can see Mezcal continuing to trend upward, and tequila hopefully will realize they're starting to get left behind and pick things up.
Auction pricing, or the whiskey pricing thing, is interesting because just looking at the auctions for the last 2 months, the prices are really high. And you would have thought, I think a lot of people were feeling like we were almost at the precipice of the boom, of the bubble bursting, because things have been so crazy for so long. And I think the way you described it is exactly, I agree exactly with that. It's quality was going down, price was going up. But isn't it weird how people are just willing to spend even more money now, especially in these times?
It's very, very strange. Yeah.
And then another question we missed from earlier on, which is any tips for pairing whiskey with beer and food?
Whiskey with beer. I'll be honest. So I am pretty big into craft beer as well. That started for me probably about 2 years ago. And so, I love really good bourbon barrel aged stouts, or some really good sours, some creamy, really nice IPAs. Enjoy those as well. But as far as pairing those together, typically we'll do it like when we're tasting whiskey amongst my friends, we'll do an IPA in between some whiskeys, usually to help kind of cleanse the palate and that type thing. We'll do little IPAs cutting. Yeah, I've never really experimented with doing like whiskeys with like stouts. It sounds interesting, considering that a lot of them are coming out of those ex-bourbon barrels, but I don't really have that much information on that. But as far as pairing with food, I always tend to look at the flavors that we find in bourbon and then use that to kind of create, like, if I'm going to do a party, I'll do a tray of, cheeses, because cheese is the lactose and there's going to make the palate feel a little creamy, just like with wine. It makes the wine feel a little creamier. It'll make the spirit feel a little creamier. And then, of course, we'll start getting into the berries and the nuts and the milk and dark chocolates and pears and, those type of, all the notes that we typically would find in bourbons, I try to put out on the trays.
I bet all your friends want to just come to your house all the time.
Every now and then. Every now and then.
So Ed in particular is very into his beers, and we as a group have got quite a lot of people who are big into their beers. We actually did a rye, a stout that was aged in rye barrels. So it was cherry biscotti coffee? I can't remember exactly what the combination was.
Yeah.
It was amazing. Really, really good.
It was an old North Coast, sorry to get on beer. There was an old North Coast from 2013 where they did the rye barrel and the wheated barrel. And that rye was very, very good back then.
Nice. Okay, so I think we've got a last couple of questions. So old Elijah versus new Elijah, what's your take?
So the old Elijah Craig 12 was delicious for $25. I loved it. It had a really nice combination of plenty of bright cherry and let's say, red berry fruits going on, but it also had a lot of oak and depth. So I really enjoyed that. Really nice balanced bourbon. The newer ones, again, we're losing the depth to me. So the newer ones are really fruity, but they just don't have nearly as much oak or cocoa, leather, that type of notes. So I enjoy them, but yeah, give me the older personally.
Nice. And I think any more from you, Ed? I think that's pretty much it from the group.
I think we've pretty much covered everything.
We're good. Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time. Obviously, if you're ever over in London, you've got to come and meet up with us or let us know in advance so we can do some kind of tasting once all of this madness has blown over. But yeah,
that sounds fantastic.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yes.
And yeah, we hope to speak. Yeah, pleasure. And we hope to get you on again soon. And yeah, take care of yourself and stay safe.
Everyone, please. Yep. Thank you.
Cheers, Chris. Thank you very much.
Cheers. See ya. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.